My name is Eric Pavlett, and I'm with Pius V Pro Chapter of Lay Dominicans, and we follow the spirituality of St. Dominic in our lay vocation. If you want to find out more, then you can pick up one of these business cards and visit www.piusv.org. Our talk today is by Father John Corbett. Father Corbett grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and came to know the Dominicans through family members in the order, through St. Patrick's Parish, and through attending Providence College, from which he graduated in 1973 with a BA in political science. Father Corbett joined the Dominicans in the summer of 1974 and was ordained a priest on May 12, 1980. He completed his licentiate in sacred theology in 1981 and began to teach moral theology at Providence College. 3 years later, he began his doctoral studies at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and was awarded his PhD after completing his dissertation on the theology of virtue and the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Father Corbett was appointed to the faculty of the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio in 1991 and spent the next 7 years teaching various courses in moral theology. Joining the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in the fall of 1998, Father Corbett teaches in the area of fundamental moral theology and the theology of the virtues. He also offers several seminars, including Thomistic action theory and contemporary interpretations of natural law. Ladies and gentlemen, Father John Corbett.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be with you this morning, and my topic is the problem of cooperation in evil action. It's a difficult topic for any number of reasons. I'd like to begin by explaining why I think the topic is so difficult and frustrating. I think first of all, what is the problem? The problem is cooperation in an evil action of another. And that is a difficult problem, not because you're wondering about whether it's good or bad to do evil yourself. I mean, that's fairly clear. The problem is not your action which is evil. The problem is that your action seems to further the action of someone else, which would be evil. Okay? So the problem here is not, so let's say you're a mailman, an employee of the U.S. Postal Service, and you have been assigned the task of handing out the mail, and you go up and down the street, and you see that one person at one address gets mail like 6 different ways to blow up your congressman, or other pieces of literature that you think are inflammatory, harmful, hateful. Do you hand the mail? Do you give him his mail, or do you exercise a prudential judgment on his behalf and throw the mail away? Well, the question is, if you give him the mail, you seem to be furthering his own or her own evil actions, and if you don't, you're going to get fired and you're not carrying out your functions as a postal service. So the problem then is not can you do evil yourself, the question is can you further an action of someone else which is evil. Now you might say, well the answer is clear, no, don't do it. And in many cases the answer is just that simple, but in many other cases it's not. And besides, we can't help but further the evil actions of other people. It depends on how proximate or remote the occasion is, but we, in fact, simply, for example, by paying taxes, of further evil actions. I mean, suppose you have a government that is taking a policy, a foreign policy, let's say that the government is involved in a war that you think is foolish, stupid, immoral, and wasteful, and a lot of your tax dollars go to the military, which support this foolish and immoral war effort. If you pay your taxes, you are furthering the war effort. You can be said to be, at least indirectly, an agent of the warfare, right? So what is your obligation? Do you have to refuse to pay the taxes, or are you obliged to pay them anyway? And if you do pay the taxes, are you morally accountable for the mayhem that the government may cause? If you work in a pharmacy, if you are, let's say, the cashier, if you're a cashier, you're a kid, you're 17 years old, you're getting money together for college, and CVS Pharmacy is in need of people to man the cashiers. Good. Can you cooperate in the selling of bad products? Let's say they've got porn on sale behind the counter, and somebody says, can I have this or that issue of this or that magazine? If you hand them the magazine and take the money, are you facilitating pornography? Are you directly helping someone else to sin? And if you help someone else to sin, are you sinning yourself? Now, you don't have to scratch the surface too deeply to find that there are lots of examples where people seem to be drawn willy-nilly into the bad actions of others. I think fundamentally the problem comes down to a species of the problem of double effect. The question, that's a general question in moral theology, and it really is concerned with the problem of accepting bad consequences of an action, you see. If you do an action that's good in itself, but it has bad results, is it morally permissible for you to perform the action? And this, I think, the problem of cooperation is a species of the problem of double effect, because really what you're dealing with is trying to analyze the morality of an action which has as a bad result, a bad consequence, someone else is being furthered in an evil action, you see. So that's why I think it comes down to a species or an instance of the problem of double effect. Now, I want to say something about why I think this particular problem is in fact difficult and exercises the most competent, intelligent moralists have difficulty with this. Why? I think it's because it mixes up two different functions of practical reason and two different degrees of certitude that you can get when you deal with practical reason. I think practical reason has a couple of different functions. One is evaluative or normative, and the other is constructive. In other words, one of the jobs that we assign practical reason when we're trying to evaluate action is justification. Is this or is this not a good type of action to perform, right? So what you're looking at is, first of all, an evaluation of the action according to its species. What sort of action is this? Now, if you can locate the sort of action it is with some kind of precision, you're already a long way towards solving your problem. Because the logic that's involved is deductive, okay? So if you're clear that the action that you're contemplating is in fact a kind of murder, if you're sure that the action qualifies as murder, then your practical reasoning is pretty simple. All murder is wrong. This particular action I'm thinking about amounts to murder, therefore this action is wrong and not to be pursued. All right? That's not that difficult. You can go from the universal to the particular, and when you're going from the universal to the particular in the service of the classification of a kind of action, your reason can operate pretty reliably, and you can be often pretty happy with the certitude that you end up with. But there's another function of practical reason, which is not so much evaluative as constructive. Here what you're trying to do is not so much evaluate a course of action that has been completed. What you're trying to do is construct an action, see, to get to an end. So with the one type of action where you're evaluating it, you could evaluate it according to a rule, and on a rule-based reasoning. And on the other, when you're trying to figure out what actually you need to do, the kind of logic that's governing you is means-ends reasoning, you see. So what you're trying to do is construct or build up an action, propose an action that will take you where you want to be. How do I get from Washington, D.C. to Catonsville? Now, see, deductive reasoning from norms has the capacity to be certain, but there isn't any real certainty in the description of how to get from D.C. to Catonsville, because there are so many contingencies. You see what I mean? Just by the House of Studies, the normal thing would be to go out South Dakota Avenue, but what happens if South Dakota Avenue is blocked off? Well, then you have to go down, North Capitol Street, and what if that's blocked off? Well, then you leap around Hawaii Avenue, and you see what I mean? When you're dealing with constructive plans, when you're trying to put together an actual plan about what you have to do, what you are faced with is a lot of particular contingencies that don't map out easily on any schema that's universal. See what I mean? In the one way of thinking, you have universal rules and particular applications that admit of certitude. But when you're dealing with another function of practical reason, which is actually trying to figure out what to do, you have to deal with innumerable variety and circumstance, which makes it difficult to have an universality. What will work Saturday will not work Sunday. What will work Sunday might not work next Sunday, see? So that's what makes life difficult. Now, I think that in the problem of cooperation, your problem is that you have to do both functions at the same time. I mean, if you've got a practical problem of conscience, you have to figure out how to act in such a way as to take you to where you want to go. But you also have to evaluate the action according to universal moral norms. And trying to do both of them, trying to integrate both styles of thinking at the same time is a little bit like trying to tango and rumba at the same moment. It leads to a bit of confusion. Anyway, let's, having said why I think the problem of cooperation is a bit difficult, I'd like to give at least some general principles that can maybe help us out or help us to think about the situation. Most moralists begin to handle the question of the problem of cooperation by distinguishing between formal cooperation and material cooperation. This gets us started in the right direction because at least we can say that formal cooperation in evil is always wrong. Formal cooperation is assistance provided to the immoral act of a principal agent in which the cooperator intends the evil. The assistance need not be essential to the performance of the act in order for the cooperator to intend the evil of the principal agent's act. Formal cooperation in evil actions, either explicitly or implicitly, is never morally licit. So the basic idea there is that if you're working with somebody or performing an action that furthers someone's evil end, and you endorse, enjoy, whistle, stamp, and give applause for the evil end, then you have, according to the jargon, formally cooperated with the action. And that formal adherence to the bad end of the agent makes you as guilty as the agent. Now this is interesting because this particular kind of cooperation, formal cooperation, is always sufficient to destroy the moral quality of your action, no matter what removed, no matter how many steps removed you are from actually causing the evil effect. So, for example, if you are someone who works, well, let's say you're a pizza delivery guy, okay, and you've been called by a local business establishment to deliver pizzas, 6 of them, pepperoni and anchovies. Excellent, you say to yourself. I approve of these people's taste in pizzas. All right. Then you find out that it's Planned Parenthood who is ordering the pizzas, and the busy, industrious staffers there who are busy and happily terminating human lives require some sustenance, you see. They are hungry. It's time for lunch. Can you bring them the pizzas? Because, it may fuel them, it may give them more energy. Well, I think that most people would say that preparing pizzas for people who do abortions at Planned Parenthood is pretty far removed from abortion itself. But if the pizza bringer thinks to himself or herself, oh good, I love Planned Parenthood and I love the work they do at that clinic and I just want to help them, that would be formal cooperation in the guilt of abortion. See, endorsing the end and helping someone pursue that end is always immoral, no matter how far removed your actual cooperation is from the evil effect. You see what I mean? So if you're a Catholic and you bring pizzas to Planned Parenthood, bringing pizzas in themselves isn't what you would call a mortal sin, but approving of the end for which you bring the pizzas, namely abortion, that could be mortally sinful, you see. So even something which in itself doesn't seem like a big deal can be a big deal depending on the end that you have in view when you perform the action. Does that make sense? All right. Now, there is a distinction they draw between explicit formal cooperation and implicit formal cooperation. With explicit formal cooperation, the cooperator directly approves of, intends, and concurs with the principal agent's immoral act. A hospital CEO who wrote up and implemented a policy permitting the direct sterilization of patients in the hospital would be involved in explicit formal cooperation. The CEO is not the principal agent of the immoral act. The CEO doesn't perform the sterilizations, but does intend the sterilizations to occur and on the hospital premises and under the auspices of the hospital. Formal explicit cooperation happens when this hospital CEO intends the sterilizations to happen as his goal. Now, there's implicit formal cooperation. It's still formal cooperation. You still intend the action, that is to say, you endorse the aim of the other person. But here, what you're endorsing the aim for is a means rather than an end. So the hospital CEO who cooperates with sterilization, let's say he's in charge of a Catholic hospital and he allows physicians to use rooms in the hospital for direct sterilizations. He may not like sterilizations himself, but in fact this makes other kinds of financial cooperation possible and brings in oncology research and does a lot of other good things. So that may be the real good that he's after. Nevertheless, even if he only intends the evil end as a means to his further good end, it would still be formal cooperation in evil, only this time it would be implicit formal cooperation. All right. I think we've seen enough to know about what formal cooperation is. It's when you embrace the bad will of the other as your own. That's always ruled out. Then we have material cooperation. And this is different. This is assistance provided to the immoral act of a principal agent in which the cooperator does not intend the evil. Okay? The elements needed to define material cooperation are, first of all, there has to be a free and knowing assistance to the evil act of another. And secondly, there has to be an absence of intending the principal agent's evil acts. Okay? If these two factors obtain in any given case, then the moral agent is engaged in material cooperation. Now, the rule is all formal cooperation is ruled out. When you get to material cooperation in evil, it's a good bit more complicated. Sometimes material cooperation is permitted, or generally judged by moralists to be good, or at least permittable, and other times it's not. There isn't any universal rule here. Material cooperation sometimes is permissible, sometimes it's not. Now we want to talk a bit about the different kinds of material cooperation. There's immediate material cooperation. Now this occurs when the cooperator does not share the intention of the principal agent, but does participate in circumstances that are essential to the commission of the act, such that the act could not occur without this participation. In other words, what you're dealing with here is working with someone who's doing something evil in such a fashion that the evil that the other person is doing couldn't happen without your help. Other people, other moralists thinking about this would word this condition a bit differently, or word this circumstance a bit differently, and they would say that immediate material cooperation is such that the object of the action, the object of your act, would be morally indistinguishable from the object of the moral act of the principal agent. Okay. Now what would that be? What would an example of that be? Well, I would think that someone immediately cooperating would be, let's say if you're in an execution, someone is sentenced to die by lethal injection. You are one of the medical people who are sent to supervise the execution. God knows why they do this, but they sometimes sterilize the arm of the condemned person before they put the needle in that will deliver the lethal drugs. Habits die hard, I suppose. You put on a white coat and you automatically sterilize an arm. Anyway, the nurse or the doctor or the medical technologist who sterilizes the arm is involved, I think, in immediate material cooperation in the execution. You might argue that you could say that the person doesn't actually kill the person, right? I mean, you could say that all I did, if you were on trial in a later century for having participated in capital punishment, one of your lines of defense might be, I didn't kill the person, I merely sterilized the arm and put the needle in, but I didn't push the button that delivered the lethal drugs. Well, this would be classified as immediate material cooperation because without your work in sticking the needle in, the death wouldn't have occurred, you see. And the object of your act is pretty much indistinguishable from the action of the person who pushes the button and delivers the lethal drugs. Okay. Now, the common opinion is that immediate material cooperation in intrinsically evil actions is always prohibited. It's morally illicit. So, Catholic healthcare organizations are not permitted to engage in immediate material cooperation in actions that are intrinsically immoral, such as abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, and direct sterilization. For example, if a Catholic health care organization agrees, now this would be controversial, but if a Catholic health care organization agreed to supply all the surgical instruments to a non-Catholic women's hospital as part of a larger agreement, collaborative agreement, and these instruments are to be used in direct sterilizations, then you might argue that the Catholic Party is engaging in immediate material cooperation. There's no intent to provide the sterilizations because the governing, managing, and financing of them is completely segregated from the collaborative arrangement. But without the supply of surgical instruments, there wouldn't be any sterilization. And so if your supply of sterilizations was a sine qua non for the sterilization operations, then it would be held to be immediate material cooperation and thus illicit. Now, you can see how technical and difficult this gets because you could counter this argument and say, yes, but if I don't supply the instruments, someone else will, hence what I supply is not indispensable because they'll just go to someone else to get the instruments. And we don't intend the instruments to be used for sterilizations, we intend them to be used for their proper medical purposes. What they do with them is not something we control or have any control over, and therefore the morality of that can't be traced back to us, you see. Because now if there were one, I would say this, I think that argument has force. Surgical instruments can be used for many purposes, most of them illicit, and I don't think that you would need to be involved directly in the in this kind of immediate material cooperation merely by supplying surgical instruments, because they admit of more than, many good uses as well as a bad use. However, if there was a kind of instrument that had one and only one kind of use, and the only use that it had was an evil one, and in fact the predominant use of it is evil, then I think if you supply the instruments, you are in fact immediately material cooperating. So they have, suppose sonograms of infants were used, or the testing for the DNA had one and only one practical use, that is to say, discovery of Down syndrome. If there was one technique that was used only for that purpose, and that was itself only used for the purpose of diagnosing Down syndrome for the purposes of aborting when that diagnosis was confirmed, you'd have immediate material cooperation, and it would be illicit. Then there's immediate material cooperation. Immediate material cooperation occurs when the cooperator participates in circumstances that are not essential to the commission of an action, such that the action would occur even without this cooperation. And many people think that immediate material cooperation in an immoral act might be justifiable if you have three basic conditions. First of all, if some great good were to be gained or prevented from being lost, or if some great evil were to be avoided. Immediate material cooperation might be licit according to proper proportion between the goods to be protected or the evils avoided on the one hand, and the evil of the principal agent's act on the other. It's generally thought that the graver the evil to which the cooperator contributes, the graver the good ought to be, or the evil, or the more serious the evil avoided must be. So, in other words, when you have a trivial gain to be gained and a great evil to be perpetrated, of course, there's no proportionate reason or no proportionality between the good gained and the evil done, and the action would be wrong. On the other hand, if a great good is to be gained by immediate material cooperation and a tremendously important evil would be averted, then the argument would be that it might be licit. Secondly, there's another factor that has to be considered here. The reason for cooperation must be proportionate to the causal proximity of the cooperator's action and the principal agent's action. Immediate material cooperation can be either proximate, very close, or remote. This is not a difference of physical or geographical location, it means causal difference. The difference between proximate and remote here refers respectively to immediate material cooperation that has a direct causal influence on the act of the principal agent, and that which has an indirect causal influence, which is remote. So the idea would be that if you're going to cooperate in this way, you have greater reason to cooperate the further removed you are from the causal chain which leads up to the bad action. And the closer the causal link between your cooperative act and the performance of the evil act, the closer the causal link, the more reason you have to refrain, to abstain. See? Give an example of this. Let's see. You're a cab driver, and you take people to all sorts of destinations in the district. Many of them are salutary. Many of them are not, or some of them are not. Somebody gets into your cab and says, hey, take me to 700 West Seton Stone Drive. All right. 700 West Seton Stone Drive, you happen to know, is a crack house. Okay? Or let's say it's a brothel. All right, it's a brothel. So you you really want to go there, you think to yourself. He looks eager to go there. Okay, so off you